Hello, and welcome. If you're listening to this, perhaps you're settling in for the night, finding a comfortable position, letting the day slowly fall away. Or maybe you're looking for something calm to accompany your evening. A gentle voice, a steady story, something to quiet the noise. Whatever brought you here, you are welcome. Tonight, we're going to talk about oakum picking. There's no rush, we have time. So settle in, breathe, and let's begin this journey together into the past, into the workhouses, into the quiet rhythm of hands pulling rope apart, one fiber at a time. In the dim light of a Victorian workhouse, there was a sound, steady, persistent, almost rhythmic. The soft rasp of fiber against fiber, the quiet pull of hands moving without thought, following a pattern repeated 10,000 times before. This was oakum picking. It was not dramatic work. There were no hammers striking anvils, no great wheels turning, no songs sung in unison, just hands and rope and time, stretching forward like the fibers themselves, one strand at a time. Today, we're going to sit with this forgotten task. We'll explore the texture of it, the purpose behind it, the slow, grinding reality of what it meant to pick oakum in the 18th and 19th centuries. Let's begin not with the people yet, but with the material itself. Oakum was nothing more than old rope unraveled. But to understand oakum, you must first understand rope, naval rope, the thick tar-soaked cables that held sailing ships together, that raised their sails and secured their anchors. These ropes spent years at sea, battered by salt spray and wind, stretched and strained, soaked again and again in pine tar to keep them from rotting in the damp. When a rope finally wore out, when its fibers began to fray beyond usefulness, when it could no longer be trusted to hold fast in a storm, it did not simply disappear. In an age when nothing was wasted, when every scrap had value, these old ropes found new purpose. They became oakum. The process was simple in concept. Take the old rope, untwist it, pull it apart, strand by strand, fiber by fiber, until all that remained was a mass of loose hemp or jute, still sticky with old tar, ready to be repurposed. And what was it used for? Ship caulking, primarily. The gaps between the wooden planks of a ship's hull had to be sealed, made watertight. Oakum was hammered into those seams, then covered with hot pitch. It swelled when wet, creating a seal that kept the ocean out. Without it, ships leaked. With it, they sailed. But oakum had other uses too. It sealed pipes. It appeared in wound dressings, its fibers absorbent, its tar thought to have some antiseptic quality. It filled the gaps in construction, in plumbing, wherever a seal was needed and money was scarce. This was valuable material, not glamorous, but essential. And someone had to make it. Picture, if you will, the vast forests of masts that filled British harbors in the age of sail. Hundreds of ships, each one requiring constant maintenance, constant repair. The Royal Navy alone operated hundreds of vessels, merchant fleets numbered in the thousands. Every single one of those ships needed oakum. When the British Empire was at its height, when naval power meant survival and trade meant wealth, the demand for oakum surged. More ships meant more rope, and more rope eventually meant more old rope to be picked apart. Consider this single detail preserved in naval records from 1849. In one delivery alone, the Royal Navy received 1,601 pounds of oakum, nearly a ton of unraveled fiber, picked clean by countless hands, delivered to the dockyards to keep the fleet seaworthy. And that was just one delivery, one dockyard, 1 month perhaps. Multiply that across the empire, across the decades, and you begin to sense the scale. Mountains of old rope waiting to be transformed, an endless supply of material meeting an endless demand for labor. The question became, who would do this work? It was tedious, it was hard on the hands, it offered no skill to learn, no craft to master. It was simply pulling, untwisting, separating, hour after hour after hour. Not the kind of work anyone would choose. But choice in the 19th century was a luxury not everyone possessed. In 1834, the British Parliament passed the Poor Law Amendment Act. This was not a gentle piece of legislation. It was designed quite deliberately to solve what the authorities called the problem of the poor, the growing number of people seeking relief, seeking help when they could not feed themselves or their families. The solution was the workhouse, and the principle behind the workhouse was this: relief would be available, yes, but it would be unpleasant enough that only the truly desperate would seek it. The conditions inside would be, by design, worse than the worst conditions outside. This was called less eligibility. You had to be deterred from asking for help, and one of the primary ways to deter you was oakum. Oakum picking became standard work in workhouses across Britain. It required no training, no tools beyond the rope itself. It could be done sitting down, which meant the elderly could do it, children could do it, the sick could do it. But most importantly, it was unpleasant enough to serve as punishment for the crime of being poor. The workhouse sold the oakum back to the dockyards, to construction firms, to anyone who needed it. The money went to offset the cost of housing and feeding the inmates, and the labor itself served as a test. If you were willing to sit for 10 hours picking oakum, then perhaps you truly had no other choice. Perhaps you truly needed help. It was a system that funded itself while breaking the spirit of those trapped within it.
Oakum. We've spoken of the system, of the rope, of the rooms where this work was done. But a system is nothing without the people caught within it. And oakum picking, this endless, monotonous work, was not done by machines or by choice. It was done by human hands, specific hands, belonging to specific people, with specific stories, specific reasons for finding themselves on those hard benches, fingers working at tar-soaked rope. So let us turn now to them, to the paupers and the orphans, to the widows and the unwed mothers, to the children and the elderly, to those who had fallen through the cracks of society, or who had been pushed, or who had simply been unlucky enough to be born in the wrong place, at the wrong time, into the wrong circumstances. These were the hands that picked oakum. Let us meet them, slowly, one by one. The largest group by far were the paupers. This is a word we don't use much anymore, but in the 19th century it had a specific meaning. A pauper was someone who relied on parish relief to survive, someone who could not support themselves, someone who had no money, no property, no family able to help them. You became a pauper in many ways. Perhaps you were a laborer and work dried up. Seasonal workers, agricultural workers who found themselves jobless in winter might end up in the workhouse picking oakum until spring came and the fields needed hands again.
Perhaps you were a tradesman and you fell ill. A few weeks unable to work, and suddenly you couldn't pay rent, couldn't buy food. The workhouse opened its doors, and oakum picking became your occupation. Perhaps you were simply old. You'd worked all your life, but there were no pensions then, no safety nets. When your body gave out, when you could no longer earn your keep, the workhouse was the only option. And so they sat, these paupers, these people who had once had names, identities, trades, lives, now reduced to a single category, those who picked oakum. Their hands moved through the rope day after day, producing the pounds of fiber required of them, earning their meager keep. Among the paupers, widows formed a significant portion. A woman's security in those days often depended entirely on her husband. When he died, everything changed. If there was property, it often went to male relatives. If there were children, they became her responsibility alone, mouths to feed, bodies to clothe, with no income to support them. A woman might try to find work, washing, sewing, cleaning, but women's wages were a fraction of men's, barely enough to survive even if work was available. And if she had small children, she couldn't leave them to work long hours. The workhouse became inevitable. Inside, she picked oakum alongside the others, her children beside her if they were old enough. Her fingers, perhaps once soft, once cared for, grew hard and black with tar. The work made no distinction. A woman who once ran a household, who had been respectable, who had been loved, she picked oakum just the same as everyone else. The rope didn't care who you had been. If widows were treated with some measure of sympathy, unwed mothers were not. An unmarried woman with a child was seen as morally suspect, fallen. The phrase idle hands was often applied to them, as though their pregnancy itself was evidence of laziness, of moral weakness. The workhouse treated them accordingly. They were assigned oakum picking just like everyone else, but with an additional burden of shame. They were often separated from other women, marked out, made examples of. The message was clear. This is what happens when you stray from propriety. And still they had to pick. Fingers working through the rope, hour after hour. The child they'd carried now taken away to the nursery wing, brought to them only for feeding if they were allowed to nurse at all. The tar stained their hands. The work broke their backs, but the system required their labor, and so they gave it. Children picked oakum too. In workhouses across Britain, in institutions like Toth Hill Fields in London, children as young as 5 or 6 were set to work. Their small fingers were considered well suited to the task. They could tease apart the finer fibers, work with the smaller pieces of rope. The quotas were adjusted for their age, but not by much. A child might sit for 8 hours, 10 hours picking rope. Their hands grew sore. The tar stuck to their skin. They weren't always given tools, no picks, no hooks, just their bare fingers pulling at the hardened fibers. Some of these children were orphans with nowhere else to go. Some had been abandoned, left at the workhouse door by parents who couldn't feed them. Some came with their mothers, families kept together in the barest sense, but separated during the working hours. There was no school for these children, no play, no childhood as we understand it, just oakum and the slow passage of time, and the hope, perhaps, that someday they would be old enough, strong enough to leave and find work elsewhere, if they survived that long. At the other end of life, the elderly sat on the same benches, men and women in their 60s, 70s, even older, bodies worn down by decades of labor, farm work, factory work, whatever hard employment they'd done before age made them useless to the wider economy. For them, oakum picking was particularly difficult. Arthritic hands struggled with the rope, fingers that no longer bent properly, joints swollen and painful, trying to pull apart fibers that resisted. Failing eyesight made the work harder. The dim light of the workhouse, the dark tar on darker hemp, everything blurring together. But there was no retirement, no rest. The elderly had to earn their keep, just like everyone else. If they couldn't meet their quota, if their hands simply wouldn't cooperate, if the pain was too great, they might have their food reduced, punishment for inability. So they sat and they picked, slowly, painfully, their fingers remembering patterns even when their minds wandered. This was how some people ended their lives, not in comfort, not surrounded by family, but on a hard bench, pulling apart rope, trying to meet a quota set by someone who'd never had to pick oakum themselves. Pregnancy offered no escape from oakum picking. Women in the workhouse, whether married or unmarried, continued their labor up until the moment of birth. Heavy with child, their backs aching, their fingers swollen, they still had to meet their quotas. The work was sitting, after all. You could do it while pregnant. That was the logic. Never mind the exhaustion, never mind the discomfort of sitting for hours on a hard bench with a growing belly. Never mind the stress, the physical strain, the sheer grinding misery of it. The system required productivity. When labor began, when a woman finally went into childbirth, she was taken to the lying-in ward, and after, if she and the baby survived, she had perhaps a few days to recover. Then back to the oakum room. The rope was waiting. The quota remained. There's a particular cruelty in the phrase productive idlers. This was how some workhouse administrators referred to blind inmates. They couldn't see, so they were considered idle, useless, unproductive. But they could still pick oakum. Their fingers could still feel the rope, could still pull it apart. And so they were set to work, often with the same quotas as sighted pickers. Imagine it, sitting in darkness or in the gray blur of partial sight, your world reduced to touch and sound, the texture of the rope in your hands, the rasp of fiber against fiber, the breathing of the other workers around you. No visual reference to show you progress, just the slow accumulation of picked fiber measured by weight at the end of the day. Some blind pickers became quite skilled. Their fingers developed sensitivity, learning to read the rope's structure by touch alone. But skill didn't make it easier, didn't make it less monotonous. It was still oakum, still endless, still the only option available to them. For deaf-mute inmates, the oakum room held a particular isolation. Workhouses already enforced silence during work hours. Talking was forbidden, or at least discouraged. The oakum room was meant to be quiet, orderly, each person focused on their task. But for those who couldn't hear and couldn't speak, the silence was total. No possibility of whispered conversation, no chance of catching a sympathetic word or a shared complaint. Just the work and the isolation and the inability to communicate with anyone around you. They picked oakum alongside everyone else. Same benches, same rope, same tar-stained fingers, but in their own particular silence. The rope passed through their hands, time passed, unmarked by sound, and the fiber. We've met the people, the hands that would do this work. But before those hands ever touched the rope, before the first fiber was pulled, there was another story. The story of the rope itself, where it came from, what condition it arrived in, what had to be done to it before it could even be picked. Because the rope that came to the workhouse, to the prison, to the oakum room, it did not arrive ready for delicate fingers. It arrived as something else entirely, something harder, something fouler. Let us follow the rope's journey from the ship to the dockyard, to the hands that would prepare it, and finally to those who would pick it apart. This is where the work truly began. Picture a bale of old rope delivered to the workhouse gate. It has come from the dockyard, from a naval storehouse, from a merchant vessel that's been broken up for parts. The rope has served its time, months, years, sometimes decades at sea. It has been soaked in seawater, dried in the sun, frozen in northern waters, baked in tropical heat, and it has been tarred again and again. Pine tar was applied to rope regularly to preserve it, to keep it from rotting in the constant damp of shipboard life. The tar soaked into the hemp fibers, coating them, binding them together. When fresh, this made the rope stronger, more durable. But when old, when the rope had been retired, cut away, bundled up and sent to shore, the tar had hardened into something like stone. The rope arrived stiff, rigid, not flexible like living rope, but solid as wood in places. The tar had crystallized, forming a crust on the outer surface, and beneath the tar, sea salt had worked its way deep into the fibers during years of ocean spray. Salt crystals clung to the hemp, fine, sharp granules embedded in the weave. This was what you received, not soft fiber ready to be teased apart, but a mass of hardened material that first had to be broken down. That work, the preparation, was as brutal as the picking itself, perhaps more so. Before oakum could be picked, it had to be beaten. Wooden mallets, heavy and blunt, were the primary tool for this. The rope would be laid out on a hard surface, a stone floor, a wooden bench, whatever was available, and then it would be struck, repeatedly, methodically, to break apart the tar crust. The sound echoed through the workhouse. Thud, thud, thud. The mallet coming down, over and over, the person swinging it putting their full weight into each blow. The tar was stubborn. It didn't want to crack, but persistence and force would eventually do it. You could hear the moment when the crust gave way, a different sound, sharper, a cracking rather than a dull thud. And then the tar shards would fly, small pieces, sometimes large ones, breaking off and scattering, sharp-edged fragments of old tar, hardened and brittle, flying through the air with each strike of the mallet. If you were doing the beating, you learned quickly to keep your face turned away. The shards could cut, could catch you in the eye if you weren't careful. Your arms grew tired. Your hands, gripping the mallet, began to ache, but the rope had to be beaten thoroughly along its entire length before it could be passed on to the pickers. This was preliminary work, the foundation of oakum picking, and it was hard, physical, jarring labor that left you covered in tar dust and salt crystals. The salt embedded in the rope was its own challenge. Sea salt, after years of exposure, didn't just sit on the surface, it worked its way into the rope's structure, crystallizing between the fibers, bonding with the tar, becoming part of the rope's very composition. When you beat the rope, when you later picked it, these salt crystals remained. They were sharp, finer than sand, but harder, with edges that scraped against your skin. As you worked the rope, whether beating it or picking it, the salt abraded your hands. Tiny cuts opened up, invisible at first, but felt keenly when the tar worked into them. The salt also made the rope heavier, denser. A length of rope that had spent years at sea weighed more than fresh rope of the same size, waterlogged and salt-saturated even after drying. And there was the smell. Old salt, old seawater, a briny scent that mixed with the tar and the hemp into something musty and ancient. The rope carried the ocean with it even here, miles inland, in the dim workhouse where no one had ever seen the sea. Ropes that had served on ships traveling to warm climates sometimes carried passengers parasites, small creatures that had burrowed into the hemp during long months in tropical harbors, larvae of beetles, moths, sometimes stranger things, organisms that fed on plant matter and found the hemp rope a perfect host. Most died in transit, killed by cold northern waters or by the tar itself, but their remains stayed in the rope, tiny husks, shells, casings embedded in the fibers. When you picked such rope, you sometimes found them, little hard spots in the otherwise fibrous material. You'd work them out, these small foreign bodies, not always knowing what they were. Sometimes they were still alive, a beetle grub dormant through the journey, reactivated by the warmth of the workhouse or the handling of human hands. It would wriggle free, and you'd flick it away and continue working. The rope was an ecosystem, a history, a record of everywhere it had been, and all of that came with it to the picking room. Rope stored improperly, and rope was often stored improperly, developed mold. In the damp storage heaps at dockyards, in the corners of warehouses where ventilation was poor, where the rope sat for months waiting to be processed, fungus bloomed, white mold usually, sometimes green. It grew on the surface, sending delicate threads down into the hemp, feeding on whatever organic matter it could find. The smell was distinctive, musty, earthy, the smell of decay. When you handled moldy rope, the spores transferred to your hands, to your clothes. You breathed them in, fine particles floating in the air whenever the rope was moved. It made some people cough, made their eyes water, but there was no choice. The rope had to be processed regardless of its condition. Sometimes the mold was beaten away along with the tar. Sometimes it stayed, ground into the fibers, becoming part of the oakum itself. No one thought much about it. Mold was just another aspect of working with old rope, another thing to endure, another layer of unpleasantness in work that was already thoroughly unpleasant. Dockside bales of rope were stored in warehouses, in sheds, in open yards, and wherever such materials sat, rats came. They nested in the rope bales, built their homes in the spaces between coiled lengths, in the hollow centers of large coils. They gnawed on the rope, not for food, but to wear down their teeth, leaving tooth marks and frayed edges. And they left droppings, small, hard pellets, scattered throughout the bales, mixed with the rope, hidden in the folds. When the rope was moved, when bales were broken open and distributed to workhouses, the rat droppings came too. You found them as you worked the rope, between the fibers, between the tar-hardened layers, little dark pellets falling out as you beat the rope or picked it. You brushed them aside and continued working. There were lice too, not just from the rats, but from the rope itself, or rather from the people who had handled it before, dock workers, sailors, previous pickers. Lice could survive for a time in the rope's fibers, waiting for new warmth, new blood. If your workhouse received infested rope, the lice spread through the oakum room from person to person, an itching misery added to all the rest. The institutions tried to prevent this. Rope was supposed to be inspected, cleaned, but inspection was cursory at best, and cleaning was expensive. Most rope arrived as it was, vermin and all. Ships that had served disease, plague ships, cholera ships, vessels where fever had swept through the crew, were eventually stripped of their rigging just like any other ship. The rope from these ships was supposed to be destroyed. That was the official policy, but rope was valuable, and plague, once the ship had been quarantined for the appropriate time, was considered dead, gone, no longer a threat. So the rope was reused. It went to the dockyards, was processed like any other retired rope, was bundled up and distributed to workhouses and prisons. No one told the pickers where the rope had come from. There was no marking, no warning. It was just rope, old rope that needed to be picked apart. Whether anyone ever...
The rope has been prepared. It sits before you now, on the bench, in your lap, in a basket at your feet. 2-foot lengths, cut and distributed. Your daily portion. This is the moment we've been moving toward. The actual work. The thing that defined oakum picking, that made it what it was. Not the system, not the preparation, but this, the physical act of taking rope and pulling it apart. Let us slow down now. Let us examine this work closely, intimately. Let us understand what it meant to do this, hour after hour, day after day. Your hands are empty. The rope waits. You reach for the first piece, and you begin. The rope chunk is about 2 feet long, thick enough that your fingers don't quite meet when you wrap them around it, heavy with tar and salt and history. You hold it in your hands, turning it slightly, looking for the best place to begin. The surface is rough against your palms, not the roughness of wood or stone, but something else, fibrous, irregular, with the hard crust of tar creating ridges and valleys along its length. Some pieces are straighter than others. Some have been kinked or bent from their time coiled on a ship. Those kinks are harder to work with. They create tension in the fibers, making them resist separation even more than usual. But you can't choose. You work with what you're given. You find the end of the rope, where it was cut or where it has frayed naturally. This is where you'll begin the long process of unmaking what was once made. Your bare hands are your only tools. Almost your only tools. There is one tool permitted in most oakum rooms, a knee hook. It's simple, a curved piece of metal, sometimes iron, sometimes brass, attached to a leather strap or a piece of heavy cloth. You tie it around your thigh, positioning the hook just above your knee. The hook serves as an anchor point. You can loop the rope around it, brace it against your leg, giving yourself leverage when you need to pull hard to separate stubborn strands. The hook takes some of the strain that would otherwise be entirely on your fingers. It's not much, just a curved piece of metal, but it makes the difference between possible and impossible. Without it, you couldn't generate enough force to pull apart the tar-hardened rope. Your fingers alone wouldn't be strong enough. With it, the work is merely brutal instead of genuinely impossible. You position the rope against the hook, feel the metal through the fabric of your clothing pressing against your leg, adjust your grip, and you pull. Rope is twisted. That's what makes it rope rather than just a bundle of fibers. 3 strands, usually, wound together in a tight spiral. Right-hand lay, they call it, twisted clockwise, each strand wrapping around the others in a helix that gives the rope its strength. Your job is to undo that, to untwist those strands, separate them from each other, and then, eventually, pull each strand apart into its individual fibers. You start with the main untwisting. Holding one end of the rope, you twist it the opposite direction, counterclockwise, trying to loosen the spiral. This is where the knee hook helps. You brace the rope against it, use your leg as counterforce while your hands twist and pull. The rope resists. The tar has essentially glued the strands together. Years of it, soaked in, hardened, binding the fibers into a solid mass.
When the rope was alive, when it was in use, this was good. It made the rope durable, weather-resistant. Now it makes your work agonizing. You twist harder. The rope creaks slightly, a sound you feel more than hear. Something gives, just a little. A few fibers separate where the tar has cracked. You work at that spot, fingers prying, pulling the strands apart millimeter by millimeter. It's slow, it's resistant. The rope doesn't want to come apart. But you persist.
The tar crust is your constant enemy. Even after beating, even after the outer layer has been broken, tar remains throughout the rope structure. It's soaked into the fibers themselves, coating each individual strand. When you try to pull the rope apart, you're not just separating fibers, you're breaking tar bonds, shattering the connections that have formed over years. The fibers are rigid, not flexible like fresh hemp, but stiff, almost brutal. When you finally manage to pull a strand free, it doesn't bend in your hand. It holds its twisted shape like wire. You have to work it, manipulate it, sometimes break it into smaller pieces just to make it manageable enough to pick apart further. And always, always, there's the tar. Under your nails now, on your palms, between your fingers, sticky and black, accumulating with every minute of work. It doesn't wash off, not with cold water, not with the rough soap the workhouse provides. The tar stays with you, building up, coating your hands in a layer that never quite goes away. Your hands grow darker day by day. The creases in your palms turn black. The whorls of your fingerprints fill in with tar until they're smooth, unreadable. Once you've separated the main strands, and this might take 20 minutes, half an hour for a particularly stubborn piece, you move to the finer work. Each strand must be picked apart into its smaller components, each twist undone, each fiber teased free. Your fingers move in the same patterns over and over. Grip, twist, pull, pry. Grip, twist, pull, pry. Again, again, again. The repetition is the thing that breaks you, eventually. Not the difficulty of any single motion, but the fact that you make that motion 10,000 times a day, 100,000 times a week, and the rope fights you every time. Your skin, your poor skin, doesn't stand a chance. The tar grinds against it, the sharp salt crystals abrade it, the stiff fibers scrape across it with every pull, every twist. At first, your hands just become sore, tender, red in places. But you keep working. You have no choice. The quota doesn't care about sore hands. The soreness becomes rawness. The skin wears thin. In the places where you grip most frequently, the pads of your fingers, the sides of your thumbs, the skin begins to break down. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly, progressively, wearing away like stone underwater. Until one day, you realize your fingers are bleeding. The blood comes from everywhere, from the tips of your fingers where the nails meet the skin, from the knuckles where the skin splits when you bend your hand, from the webbing between your fingers where the rope has sawed back and forth. Small amounts usually, not gushing wounds, but persistent seepage. A slow, steady blood flow that mixes with the tar, creating a dark paste on your hands. You can't stop to tend to the bleeding. There are no bandages, no time to wrap your fingers even if there were. You just keep working. The blood dries, mixing with tar and hemp dust. It forms a crust. Tomorrow, you'll crack that crust open again when you start work, and the bleeding will resume. This is normal, expected. Everyone in the Oakum room has bleeding hands. The overseers don't comment on it unless the blood gets on the Oakum itself. Then you might be reprimanded for soiling the product. But blood on your own hands, on your clothes, on the bench, that's just part of the work. You develop techniques to minimize it. You learn which grips cause less bleeding. You adjust your angle of pull, the way you brace the rope, trying to distribute the damage across different parts of your hand. But you can't prevent it entirely. The work itself causes bleeding.
That's simply what happens when you pull apart tar-crusted rope with bare hands for 10 hours. You bleed, and you continue. The fibers themselves are sharper than you'd think. Hemp, when it's fresh and properly processed, can be relatively soft, but old hemp, tar-hardened, broken and frayed, it's almost like working with wire. Each fiber has small irregularities, places where the tar has crystallized into sharp points, places where the fiber has splintered, creating tiny spikes. As you pull the rope apart, these sharp points drag across your skin. It's not cutting exactly, it's abrading, grating, like working with very fine sandpaper, but sandpaper that you're forced to grip and manipulate constantly. The insides of your fingers, where the skin is more tender, suffer worst. The grating wears the skin down to rawness, not open wounds necessarily, but areas where the top layers of skin are simply gone, worn away, leaving the more sensitive layers beneath exposed. These patches burn. The tar gets into them, stinging. The salt crystals from the rope feel like fire when they touch the raw flesh. But again, there's nothing to be done about it. You wrap your hand around the next piece of rope, feel the immediate sharp burn as the fibers contact the raw spots, and you pull. Because the alternative is not meeting your quota. And not meeting your quota means reduced food, or punishment, or both. So you endure the burning. You learn to breathe through it, to let your mind detach from the pain while your hands continue their work. Your nails take tremendous abuse. To separate the tightly packed fibers, you often have to use your nails as tools, wedging them into gaps, prying strands apart, scraping away tar. The nails aren't designed for this. They're not strong enough, not thick enough. They split, lengthwise usually, a crack forming at the tip and working its way down toward the nail bed, sometimes quickly, sometimes over days of work. When a nail splits, it catches on the fibers. Every time you grip the rope, the split widens slightly. The pain is sharp, immediate, a jolt every time the crack opens a bit more. Eventually, part of the nail tears away completely, rips free, leaving the nail bed partially exposed, raw and exquisitely sensitive. The tar gets into the exposed nail bed. The infection is almost guaranteed. Your fingers throb. The pain keeps you awake at night, pulsing in time with your heartbeat. But in the morning, you return to the Oakum room. You pick up the rope. Your damaged nails catch and tear further. New splits form in nails that were still intact. The cycle continues. Some long-term pickers lose nails entirely. The nail bed becomes so damaged that the nail simply stops growing properly, leaving the fingertip protected by nothing but scar tissue. Those people are considered fortunate in a strange way. No nails means nothing to split, nothing to catch and tear. Just the scarred fingertips, numb to much of the pain. Numb enough to keep working. Your hands change. Not just temporarily, not just while you're picking. The changes become permanent. The skin thickens in response to the constant trauma. Calluses form, thick and hard, trying to protect the flesh beneath. But these aren't normal calluses. They're black, stained through with tar that's worked its way into the tissue itself. The tar doesn't stay on the surface. It penetrates, gets into the small cuts, the abraded areas, the cracks in your skin. And once it's in there, it stays. Even if you eventually leave the workhouse, even if you never pick oakum again, the tar remains. Your hands carry the mark of this work for the rest of your life. Black lines in every crease, black patches on the pads of your fingers, black under what's left of your nails. It's a brand, a visible sign that you picked oakum. People can tell just by looking at your hands where you've been, what you've done, what you've survived. The scars are more than just discoloration, though. There are ridges of scar tissue where the worst injuries healed, places where the skin split so deeply that it healed thick and irregular, knuckles that no longer bend quite right because of scarring. Your hands become tools shaped by their work, adapted to it, damaged by it, transformed into something other than they were. You might think that eventually you'd get used to it, that the pain would lessen, that your hands would adapt. In a sense, they do. The calluses help. The scar tissue is less sensitive than normal skin. But the pain doesn't go away. It changes character, becomes a constant dull ache instead of sharp stings, a background throb instead of active burning. But it's always there. And the numbness is its own problem. Your fingers lose sensitivity. You can't feel fine textures anymore, can't feel gentle touches. The nerve endings have been so abraded, so damaged, that they simply stop reporting anything subtle. You can still feel the rope, still feel the pull and resistance of the work, but you've lost something too, a kind of connection to the world through your fingertips that most people take for granted. This is perhaps the strangest cruelty of oakum picking. It doesn't just hurt, it doesn't just scar, it numbs you, takes away sensation while leaving just enough that you can still feel the pain of the work itself. You become less able to feel anything gentle, anything soft, anything kind. But the tar, the rough fiber, the grinding repetition, those you still feel perfectly. This is what it meant to pick oakum. Not in the abstract, not as policy or punishment or economic system, but physically, tactily, in your body. It meant hands that bled and scarred and went numb, nails that split and tore, skin abraded raw and then worked raw again the next day. It meant pain that never truly lessened, only changed form. And it meant doing this hour after hour, day after day, as long as
It meant pain that never truly lessened, only changed form. And it meant doing this hour after hour, day after day, for as long as you remained in the workhouse or the prison, until you were released, until you aged out, until you died. The work was endless, the rope kept coming, the quota remained, and your hands, your poor hands, kept moving through the motions. Grip, twist, pull, pry, bleeding, scarring, numbing, one fiber at a time. In our next section, we'll explore the quotas themselves, how much oakum you had to produce, what happened if you fell short, the small mathematics of survival in the oakum room. But for now, we'll rest our hands. Imagine them clean, undamaged, whole, before the tar, before the blood, before the scars. Just hands, resting, quiet. We've explored the physical reality of the work, the feel of the rope, the damage to hands, the grinding repetition. But there was another weight pressing down on those who picked oakum. Not physical weight, not the rope itself, but the weight of expectation, of measurement, of numbers that had to be met. The quota. Every day when you sat down to work, you knew how much oakum you had to produce. The number was precise, unwavering, and at the end of the day, your work would be weighed. If you had met your quota, you would eat your full ration. You would avoid punishment. If you had not, well, we'll come to that. Let us explore this system of measurement, this arithmetic of survival. Let us understand what it meant to live under the constant pressure of pounds and ounces. Let us sit with the dread of the evening weighing. For adult men, the daily quota ranged from 3 to 8 pounds of picked oakum. 3 pounds doesn't sound like much, does it? Imagine 3 bags of sugar, or a small cat. That's the weight. But remember what oakum is. It's fiber, loose, fluffy fiber pulled from compressed rope. To produce 3 pounds of loose fiber, you had to pick apart far more than 3 pounds of rope. The rope was dense, compacted. The oakum was airy, separated. A rough estimate, though it varied depending on the rope's condition, was that you needed to process perhaps 10 to 15 pounds of rope to yield 3 pounds of oakum. And you had to pick it thoroughly, pull every strand completely apart, no chunks of unpicked rope mixed in, no shortcuts. The inspectors would check. They had experienced eyes and hands. They could feel through a pile of oakum and find any pieces that weren't properly picked.
If your oakum contained unpicked sections, it wouldn't count towards your weight. Or worse, you'd be punished for attempting to cheat. So 3 pounds meant hours of work, 4, 5, 6 hours of constant picking to meet the minimum. And some men were assigned 8 pounds. Think about that, 8 pounds, more than double the minimum. To achieve this, you worked from dawn to dusk, your hands moving continuously, barely pausing to eat the meager meal provided. 8 pounds was possible, but only just. Only if you had strong hands, if the rope wasn't particularly difficult, if you knew all the techniques, if you could maintain focus and speed for the entire day. It was designed to be barely achievable. That was the point. Women's quotas were lower, 1 to 4 pounds typically. This wasn't kindness, it was acknowledgement that women's hands were generally smaller, their upper body strength less than men's. The work required leverage, grip strength, endurance. But make no mistake, 4 pounds was still brutal for a woman's hands. Still hours of pulling, twisting, prying. Still bleeding fingers and split nails. Still the same tar, the same rough fibers. The lower quota didn't make the work easier, it just made it possible to complete in a day's time. And for women who were already weakened by malnutrition, by illness, by the simple grinding poverty that had brought them to the workhouse, even 1 pound could feel impossible. But impossible or not, it had to be done. You sat on the bench, you picked up the rope, you started working. And you didn't stop until you believed you'd reached your weight. Then you waited for the evening weighing, hoping you judged correctly, hoping your pile would be enough. Children's quotas were adjusted based on age and size. A 6-year-old might be assigned half a pound, a 12-year-old a pound and a half. A 14-year-old, approaching adult size, might be given the full women's quota or even more. The calculations were precise, recorded in the workhouse ledgers. Each child assessed, measured, assigned their portion. Half a pound sounds merciful, doesn't it, for a small child? But consider, a 6-year-old's hands are tiny. Their fingers haven't developed the strength or coordination for this work. The rope is as thick in their grip as a man's wrist might be in yours. They struggled. They cried sometimes until they learned that crying brought punishment. They sat for hours, their small bodies hunched over the work, trying to pull fibers that barely wanted to move. Some children developed tricks. They learned to use their teeth to grip the rope when their fingers couldn't get purchase. They learned to brace the rope against the edge of the bench, against their own knees, using their whole body as a tool. They learned because they had to. Because even at 6 years old, you had a quota, and quotas had to be met. On naval vessels, oakum picking served as punishment for infractions. A sailor who committed some offense, showed up drunk for duty, talked back to an officer, failed to perform a task properly, might be ordered to pick 1 pound of oakum. 1 pound, a relatively small amount compared to workhouse quotas. But remember the context. This sailor was being punished during his off-duty hours, time when he should be sleeping, resting, mending his own clothes, writing letters home. Instead, he sat on the deck or in some corner below, working at rope with his tar-stained fingers. 1 pound might take 3 or 4 hours, depending on the rope's condition and his skill. Hours stolen from rest, from personal time, from the small moments of freedom that made life at sea bearable. And he did this work surrounded by his shipmates, who could see him, who knew why he was there. The humiliation was part of the punishment. Sitting there, fingers working, while others relaxed or slept. A visible marker of failure, of transgression. 1 pound, small in weight, but heavy in meaning. Pregnant women, as we mentioned before, continued to pick oakum throughout their pregnancy. Their quotas were sometimes reduced, lighter, the records say, perhaps 3 pounds instead of 4, perhaps 2 instead of 3. But lighter is relative. When you're 7 months pregnant, when sitting on a hard bench for hours makes your back scream, when your swollen fingers barely fit through the gaps in the rope, 3 pounds isn't light. The work didn't account for morning sickness, didn't pause when you felt faint or dizzy, didn't adjust for the simple physical awkwardness of trying to work with a large belly, making it difficult to lean forward, to position the rope, to use your body's leverage. You did your best. You picked your quota, or as close to it as you could manage, and you hoped the inspectors would be lenient, that they'd understand, that they'd let a small shortfall pass without punishment. Sometimes they did. More often, they didn't. The quota was the quota. Pregnancy was your problem, not theirs. For blind pickers, there was no reduction in quota. They were expected to produce the same amount as sighted pickers of their age and sex. This seems impossibly cruel, doesn't it? How could you pick the same amount when you couldn't see the rope, couldn't judge the quality of your work visually, couldn't see the pile growing in your basket? But the blind learned. Their fingers became extraordinarily sensitive. They could feel the structure of the rope in a way that sighted pickers might not fully appreciate, could sense where the strands separated, where the tar was thickest, where to apply pressure. They developed their own techniques entirely by touch, and they kept mental counts, remembered how many pieces of rope they'd worked through, estimated the weight by the feel of the basket, by the bulk of the pile. Some blind pickers became quite skilled. Their work was as thorough as anyone's, their oakum as properly picked. But it took longer, required more concentration, more mental effort to track everything without visual reference. And still, they met their quotas, because the alternative was punishment. And punishment for a blind person in a workhouse, well, there were few protections, few mercies for those already vulnerable. So they picked by feel, by memory, by sheer determination. And their piles, when weighed, met the standard. As evening approached, the anxiety built. The light through the high windows began to fade. The oakum room grew dimmer, and you knew the weighing was coming. The inspectors arrived with their scales, heavy brass scales, well maintained, and candles to provide light for their work. One by one, or sometimes in groups, the pickers brought their day's production to be weighed. You carried your basket to the inspector's table, set it down, stepped back. The inspector would examine the oakum first, run their hands through it, feeling for unpicked chunks, for rope that hadn't been properly separated. If they found issues, they'd pull those pieces out, set them aside. Those wouldn't count. Then the weighing. The oakum was transferred to the scale. The inspector adjusted the weights, balancing the scale with practiced hands. The candlelight flickered, shadows danced on the walls. You watched the scale, watched the balance arm settle. Was it enough? The inspector would note the weight in their ledger, call out the number. 3 pounds 2 ounces, 4 pounds 1 ounce, 2 pounds 15 ounces. If you'd met your quota, you would feel a wash of relief. Exhaustion. We've spoken of the work, of the hands, of the quotas that had to be met. But we haven't yet fully entered the room where this all took place. The oakum room, the oakum ward, the oakum cell. Let us step inside now. Let us feel the space, understand the hours, sense the atmosphere of these places where thousands of people spent their days. These weren't comfortable spaces. They weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for work, for discipline, for the efficient processing of human labor into usable oakum. Let us sit on those benches, feel that floor, breathe that air. Let us understand what it meant to spend 8 hours here, 10 hours, 12, day after day after day. The working day began early, dawn usually, or just before, when the first gray light began to filter through whatever windows existed. You were woken, if you'd managed to sleep at all, and directed to the Oakum room. You took your place on the bench, received your day's allotment of rope, and you began. 8 hours was the minimum in most workhouses, but many institutions required more. 10 hours, 12 hours, sunrise to sunset, with perhaps a brief break for a midday meal. 12 hours sitting, 12 hours with your hands moving through rope. Think about that span of time. 12 hours is half your day, half your waking life spent on that bench, fingers working, body still except for the small movements of picking. The morning hours were almost bearable. Your hands were stiff from sleep, yes, but also slightly rested. The pain hadn't fully built up yet. But as the hours accumulated, as morning became afternoon, afternoon became evening, the fatigue deepened. Your back ached from sitting, your shoulders hunched forward from the posture required for the work. Your fingers grew clumsier, less responsive. But the quota remained. The work continued. There was no clock to watch, usually, no way to mark the passage of time except by the light changing through the windows, moving across the floor, climbing the walls. Time became strange, elastic. Minutes felt like hours, hours blurred together into an indistinct mass of repetitive motion. You existed in a kind of stupor, hands moving automatically, mind drifting, trying to go somewhere else, anywhere else, until finally, the evening light faded and the end of the workday arrived. 12 hours, gone, transformed into pounds of oakum and tar-stained hands. Tomorrow, you'd do it again. Many Oakum rooms had stone floors. Practical from the administration's perspective, stone was durable, easy to clean, didn't absorb the tar and hemp dust that accumulated everywhere. But stone is hard and cold. The benches where you sat were wooden, but low. Often your feet rested directly on the stone floor. And in some institutions, particularly prisons, there weren't benches at all. You sat on the floor itself, directly on the cold stone for 12 hours. Perhaps you were allowed a small square of wood to sit on, perhaps not. It varied by institution, by the particular overseer's disposition, by how strictly the rules were enforced. But even with a wooden seat, the coldness of the stone floor radiated upward, seeped into your body. Your legs grew numb, your feet lost sensation. In winter, the cold was profound. It crept into your bones, making everything harder. Your fingers didn't want to bend. The rope felt even stiffer in the cold. You shifted your weight, trying to find a position that didn't hurt, that wasn't quite so uncomfortable. But there was no comfortable position. Not on stone, not for 12 hours. Your body adapted in its way. You learned to ignore certain discomforts, to let them fade into background sensation. But the stone floor, you never quite stopped feeling the stone floor. Its hardness, its coldness, its absolute indifference to your discomfort. The Oakum room was quiet, not naturally quiet. 30 people, 50 people, all breathing, all moving, all working, that should have created sound, conversation, connection. But silence was the rule, strictly enforced, rigidly maintained. The reasoning was multiple. Silence prevented conspiracy, prevented the inmates from organizing or complaining to each other. Silence maintained discipline, kept everyone focused on their individual work. And silence simply made the work more oppressive. Without speech, without the relief of conversation, you were alone with your thoughts, alone with the repetitive motion, the pain, the boredom. Some people whispered anyway, took the risk, leaned toward their neighbor and exchanged a few quiet words during a moment when the overseer's back was turned. But if caught, the punishment was swift. The strap across the knuckles, reduced rations, sometimes solitary confinement. So most people obeyed the silence. They sat and worked and said nothing. The sounds that filled the room were only the sounds of labor, the rasp of fiber, the occasional cough, the scrape of someone shifting on their bench, breathing, the rustle of clothing, the soft thud of picked oakum being added to a basket. These became the soundtrack of your days, these small, mundane sounds, endlessly repeated. No voices, no songs, no human warmth of shared complaint or comfort, just silence and work and the slow passage of hours. In prisons, the oakum picking often took place in cells, individual cells, small rooms, perhaps 8 feet by 6 feet, stone walls, stone floor, a single high window letting in gray light, and rope, piles of it, your daily allotment stacked in the corner or against the wall. That was all. No bed. You'd sleep on a plank at night, but during working hours it was stored away. No table, nothing but you and the rope. You sat on the floor, took a piece of rope, began picking. In this cell, the silence was total, not the shared silence of the Oakum room workhouse, but true isolation. No one to see, no one to hear, just you and the rope and the stone walls. Some people preferred this. The isolation meant no overseer watching constantly, no comparison with other workers, no awareness of how slowly or quickly you were working relative to others. You could pace yourself, rest for a moment when you needed to, as long as you met your quota by day's end. But for others, the isolation was its own torture, the loneliness, the absence of any human contact for hours on end. The cell walls seemed to press inward, the pile of rope seemed to grow rather than shrink. Time lost all meaning when there was nothing to mark it, no change in the environment, no variation whatsoever. Just you and the rope and your bleeding hands and the silence. For hours, for days, for weeks or years, depending on your sentence. Christmas was, in theory, a day of rest and celebration, even in workhouses. In theory. In practice, Christmas exemptions from oakum picking were rare. Some institutions gave Christmas Day off, a single day of respite, perhaps a slightly better meal, actual meat instead of the usual thin gruel, perhaps a small service, some acknowledgement of the holiday. But many institutions maintained the work schedule. Christmas or not, the quota remained. The oakum had to be picked. The reasoning was practical. The work couldn't stop. The contracts with the dockyards had deadlines. The institution's income depended on steady production. And there was also an ideological component. Christmas was a Christian holiday, yes, but it was also becoming associated with leisure, with indulgence, with family gatherings, none of which were appropriate for paupers or prisoners. You were here to work, to be reformed, to be deterred from seeking relief in the future. A day off might make you soft, might make you forget the purpose of the workhouse. So you worked. On Christmas Day, you sat on your bench and picked oakum just like any other day. Perhaps you thought about Christmas, about what it had been like before, when you had a home, a family, a place at a table. Perhaps you remembered the taste of roasted meat, the warmth of a fire, the sound of laughter. But those memories felt distant now, unreal. The reality was the rope in your hands, the tar on your fingers, the stone floor beneath you. Christmas was just another day. In the few institutions that did acknowledge Christmas, even minimally, there were rules about how it could be observed. Christmas carols, for instance, were often banned. Singing was considered disruptive. It broke the silence. It created unity among the inmates, a sense of shared experience and shared culture.
We've explored the work itself, the quotas, the rooms where it happened. But we haven't yet fully reckoned with what this work did to the body over time,
Not just the immediate pain, not just the bleeding and the blisters and the daily discomfort, but the lasting damage, the permanent changes, the slow accumulation of injury that, day by day, transformed healthy bodies into something else. This section is perhaps the hardest to sit with, because this is where we see the true cost of oakum picking, not measured in pounds of fiber, not counted in hours worked, but written on the body itself, in damaged fingers, in frozen joints, in flesh that never quite healed. Let us approach this gently. Let us understand what happened to people who picked oakum not for days or weeks, but for months, for years, for their entire childhood. Let us witness the slow ruin of human hands. In the beginning, there were blisters. This was almost universal among new pickers. The friction of the rope, the constant gripping and pulling, the sharp fibers scraping skin, blisters formed quickly. Small, fluid-filled bubbles on the palms, along the fingers, at the base of the thumb where you gripped hardest. In a clean environment, with proper care, blisters heal. The fluid reabsorbs, the skin toughens, and eventually you develop calluses that protect against future blistering. But the oakum room was not clean. The rope itself was filthy. Tar, salt, rat droppings, mold. Your hands were constantly coated in this mixture. And when a blister broke, which it inevitably did, that filth entered the wound. The blisters turned septic. Infection set in quickly. The small bubble of fluid became a pocket of pus. The skin around it turned red, hot to the touch. The pain intensified from a dull ache to a sharp, throbbing agony. And still you had to work. Still you had to grip the rope, the infected blister rupturing fully, pus and blood mixing with tar, the wound being constantly recontaminated as you worked. Some infections resolved on their own. The body fought them off. The wound eventually scabbed over and healed. But some didn't. Some spread. The redness crept up the finger, into the hand, the telltale red streaks of blood poisoning tracking up the arm. People died from this. Sepsis from a simple blister, from an infection that started small and was never given a chance to heal. Others survived, but carried the scars, pitted marks on their palms where the worst infections had been. Fingers that no longer bent quite right because the infection had damaged the underlying tissue. All from blisters, just blisters, the most common, mundane injury imaginable, made deadly by filth and continued work. Paronychus is an infection of the skin around the nails. It starts small, a bit of redness along the nail edge, some swelling, tenderness when you press on it. In normal circumstances, you'd stop using that finger for a few days, keep it clean and dry, let it heal. But in the oakum room, you had no such luxury. The infection worsened, the swelling increased, the nail bed becoming inflamed, pus forming beneath and around the nail. Chronic paronychus, infection that persists for weeks or months, destroys the nail's ability to grow properly. The nail becomes deformed, ridged, separated from the nail bed. And the infection can spread deeper, into the bone of the fingertip itself. This is where rotting becomes the appropriate word. The flesh at the tip of the finger becomes necrotic, dies, turns dark, and begins to smell of decay. The bone, exposed to infection, develops osteomyelitis, bone infection. The bone itself begins to deteriorate, to crumble. At this stage, the pain is extraordinary, constant, throbbing, impossible to ignore even through the general numbness that long-term pickers developed. The finger becomes useless. You can't grip with it, can barely bend it. The slightest touch sends jolts of agony through your hand. And the infection, if left untreated, continues to spread up the finger, into the hand, into the bloodstream. The only treatment available in most workhouses was amputation, crude amputation. When infection reached a certain point, when the finger was clearly dying, when blood poisoning became a real risk, the finger had to come off. There was no anesthetic in most workhouse infirmaries, no surgical precision, just a saw or sometimes a heavy knife and someone willing to do the cutting. You'd be held down, the infected finger isolated, and then the cutting. The pain was beyond description, white hot, all-consuming. You screamed or you bit down on leather or you passed out from the shock. The finger was removed. The stump was cauterized with a hot iron or left to bleed and heal on its own. No stitches, no proper bandaging, just crude severing and the hope that you'd survive. Many did survive. The human body is remarkably resilient, and once the infected tissue was removed, the remaining tissue often healed. But you were left with 9 fingers instead of 10, or 8. Some people lost multiple fingers over years of picking. And the loss wasn't just physical. It was practical. With fewer fingers, the work became harder. Your grip was weaker. You couldn't manipulate the rope as effectively. Meeting your quota became more difficult, which meant more risk of punishment, which meant more pressure to work even harder with your remaining damaged hands. A vicious cycle, each amputation making survival slightly more precarious. Tendinitis is inflammation of the tendons, the fibrous cords that connect muscle to bone. The repetitive motion of oakum picking was perfectly designed to cause it. The same gripping motion, the same twisting, the same pulling, thousands of times a day, day after day after day. The tendons in your fingers, your wrists, your forearms, they became inflamed, swollen, painful. Every movement hurt. Every time you gripped the rope, you felt it, a sharp, burning pain that ran from your fingertips up through your arm. Tendinitis, if given rest, can heal. The inflammation subsides, the tendons recover. But there was no rest in the Oakum room. So the tendinitis became chronic, permanent. The tendons remained inflamed, thickened, damaged. Bursitis often accompanied it. Bursitis is inflammation of the small fluid-filled sacs that cushion the joints. These too became swollen and painful. Your hands felt hot from the inside, swollen, every joint aching with a deep, persistent pain. And still, you worked. The quota didn't adjust for tendinitis. The overseers didn't care that every grip sent pain shooting through your arm. You worked through it, gritted your teeth, found ways to minimize the pain, different grips, different angles, but you couldn't eliminate it. The pain became a part of your baseline existence, something you carried always. The carpal tunnel is a narrow passageway in the wrist. Through it run tendons and the median nerve, which provides sensation and motor control to parts of the hand. Repetitive gripping motions cause the tissues in this tunnel to swell. The swelling compresses the median nerve. This is carpal tunnel syndrome. It starts with tingling, pins and needles sensation in your thumb, index, and middle fingers, numbness that comes and goes. Then it progresses. The numbness becomes constant. Your grip weakens. You start dropping things because you can't feel them properly, can't judge the force needed to hold them. In severe cases, the muscle at the base of the thumb, the thenar muscle, begins to atrophy, waste away. The thumb becomes weak, almost useless.
For oakum pickers, this was common, almost expected after enough years of work. Your hands became clumsy. You could still pick oakum, but it was harder, slower. You had to watch your hands more carefully, compensate with visual cues for the sensations you could no longer feel. The median nerve, compressed for long enough, suffered permanent damage. Even if the work stopped, even if years passed, the numbness never fully resolved. Your hands remained partially dead, capable of gross motor movements, but lacking fine control and sensation. A permanent legacy of the repetitive gripping, the constant pressure on the wrist.
We've examined what oakum picking did to the hands, to the joints, to the visible external body. But there was another kind of damage, quieter, hidden beneath the skin. Damage you couldn't see in the tar-stained fingers or the frozen shoulders. Damage that happened deep inside, in the lungs, in the eyes, in organs that silently processed the toxins and particles that came with the work. This damage was no less real for being invisible. In many ways, it was worse, more insidious, harder to understand or treat. Let us turn inward now. Let us follow the dust and the tar and the fibers as they entered the body, through breath, through touch, through the simple act of existing in that contaminated space. Let us understand what happened inside, where no one could see, where nothing could be done. With every breath you took in the oakum room, you inhaled hemp dust. It was everywhere, invisible in the air, but constant. Every time rope was beaten, every time fibers were pulled apart, microscopic particles of hemp broke free and floated. They hung suspended in the still, unventilated air, slowly settling on surfaces, on clothing, on skin, but mostly they were breathed in, into your nose, down your throat, into the delicate branching passages of your lungs. Hemp dust is organic matter, plant fiber, broken down to its finest particles. In small amounts, your lungs can handle it. The tiny hairs lining your airways, the cilia, sweep particles back up toward your throat, where you cough them out or swallow them. But in the oakum room, the amount of dust wasn't small. It was constant, relentless. Hour after hour, day after day, your lungs filled with hemp particles. The cilia couldn't keep up, couldn't clear the dust as fast as it accumulated. The particles settled deep in your lungs, in the tiny air sacs, the alveoli, where oxygen enters the blood. They lodged there, became embedded in the lung tissue, and your body tried to deal with them, sent immune cells to engulf the foreign particles, created inflammation as it attempted to protect itself. But the dust kept coming, new particles every day. Your lungs never got a chance to clear fully, to heal. The inflammation became chronic, permanent. Your lung tissue began to change, to scar in response to the constant irritation. This was the beginning, the foundation of what would become picker's cough. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, there was also the tar. Hemp dust was bad enough, but it wasn't just hemp in the air. There was tar. When you beat the rope, when you pulled it apart, tiny particles of tar broke free along with the hemp dust. Microscopic fragments of pine tar, crystallized and brittle, floating in the air alongside the plant fibers. These tar particulates were darker, heavier, more toxic. You breathed them in along with everything else. They settled in your lungs, adhered to the delicate lung tissue, and unlike hemp dust, which is organic and eventually breaks down, tar is different. Tar is essentially a mixture of hydrocarbons, complex organic compounds that don't break down easily in the body. They persist. The tar particles embedded in your lung tissue stayed there.
Over months and years of exposure, they accumulated, layer upon layer of microscopic tar deposits. Your lung tissue began to change color. Not all at once, not visibly from the outside, but inside, in the pink-gray tissue of healthy lungs, black spots appeared. Areas where tar had concentrated, where the tissue had become saturated with deposited particles. The blackening spread. More exposure, more tar, more darkening. Eventually, lungs that had been pink became mottled, gray-black, visibly contaminated with tar. This wasn't just cosmetic. The tar particles caused inflammation, damaged the delicate structures needed for breathing, reduced the lungs' ability to transfer oxygen to the blood. Your breathing became more labored, shallower, less efficient. But this happened so gradually that you barely noticed. You adapted, breathed a little harder, a little faster, compensating for the reduced capacity. Until one day you realized you couldn't climb stairs without being winded, couldn't work without pausing to catch your breath. Your lungs, once healthy, had been transformed into something else, blackened, scarred, struggling to perform their basic function, all from breathing, just breathing, in the Oakum room. They called it picker's cough, the chronic cough that almost every long-term Oakum picker developed. It was similar to miner's lung, coal workers' pneumoconiosis, black lung disease. The same mechanism, chronic inhalation of particulate matter. The same result, scarred, damaged lungs, chronic coughing. The cough started as a minor thing, just a tickle in your throat, a need to clear your airways occasionally. But it progressed. It became more frequent, more persistent, a dry, hacking cough that interrupted your work, your sleep, your every waking moment. You coughed, trying to clear what couldn't be cleared. The embedded particles, the scarred tissue, they weren't going anywhere, but your body kept trying, kept triggering the cough reflex, attempting to expel what had become part of you. The sound of the Oakum room included this coughing, a constant background rhythm. 30 people, 50 people, all coughing at intervals. Some just occasional throat clearing, others deep, racking coughs that bent them double. No one commented on it. Everyone had the cough eventually. It was just part of picking Oakum, like tar-stained hands, like bleeding fingers. Picker's cough, an expected consequence, a badge of the trade, if you could call it that. And like miner's lung, it was progressive. It didn't get better when you stopped picking, didn't resolve if you left the workhouse. The damage was done, permanent, written into your lung tissue in tar and scar. You'd cough for the rest of your life, however long that was. The elderly pickers, those who'd been at it for years, for decades, they had it worst. At night, lying on their plank beds in the sleeping quarters, they'd cough. Deep, productive coughs that brought up phlegm. Black phlegm. Not clear, not yellow or green like a normal respiratory infection. Black. Thick, dark sputum that they'd expel into rags or onto the floor. The accumulated tar and dust from their lungs mixed with mucus, finally being expelled in small amounts. The relief was temporary. Their lungs would produce more phlegm, trying to clear more particles, and the coughing would continue. Some nights it was continuous, coughing fits that lasted minutes, leaving the person exhausted, gasping, unable to get comfortable enough to sleep. The black phlegm was evidence, visible proof of what was happening inside their lungs, the blackening of tissue, the body's desperate attempt to clear contamination. But no amount of coughing could fully clear lungs saturated with years of tar exposure. The phlegm was just the excess, the overflow. The majority of the contamination remained embedded, permanent. In the morning, you'd see the evidence scattered around the sleeping quarters, black stains on floors, on walls where people had leaned while coughing. black phlegm, a reminder of what breathing in the Oakum room did to you, what it left behind. Remember the mold on improperly stored rope, the white and green fungal growth that bloomed in damp storage. Those mold spores became airborne when the rope was handled. You inhaled them along with the hemp dust and tar particles. For most people, this added another layer of respiratory irritation, more coughing, more inflammation. But for those with pre-existing conditions, asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, any kind of lung sensitivity, the mold was devastating. Mold spores trigger allergic reactions, cause airways to constrict, make breathing even more difficult. An asthmatic picker would struggle terribly, each breath a wheeze, each exposure to moldy rope bringing on another attack. There were no inhalers then, no bronchodilators, no emergency medications, just the attack itself. The terrifying sensation of not being able to breathe, airways narrowed, lungs struggling, panic setting in as oxygen levels dropped. You'd stop working, bent over, trying desperately to draw air. The overseers might allow you a moment's rest, or they might not, might insist you keep working despite your obvious distress. Eventually, the attack would pass, or it wouldn't, and you'd die. Simple as that. COPD, chronic obstructive.
We've explored what oakum picking did to the body, the visible and invisible damage to flesh and bone and organ. But there was another kind of damage, perhaps the most profound of all, what it did to the mind. The endless repetition, the enforced silence, the grinding monotony of the same motion, the same task, the same environment, hour after hour, day after day, week after week. The human mind is not designed for this. We need variation, stimulation, connection, change. The Oakum room offered none of these things. And so the mind adapted, or tried to, or broke trying. This section is difficult. We're going to explore psychological suffering, hallucinations, dissociation, the slow unraveling of mental health under unbearable conditions. But we'll approach it gently, with compassion, with understanding that what happened to these people wasn't weakness, it was the natural, inevitable result of impossible conditions. Let us sit with this quietly. Let us understand what monotony can do to a human mind. The enforced silence of the Oakum room was not natural. Humans are social creatures. We communicate, we speak, we hum, we make small sounds without even thinking about it. These vocalizations help us process our thoughts, regulate our emotions, connect with others. Take all of that away, and something breaks. In the absolute silence of the Oakum room, broken only by the sounds of work, never by human voices, the mind began to compensate. It created sounds where there were none. Auditory hallucinations. At first, you might think you heard someone whisper your name. You'd look up, glance around, but everyone was focused on their work, silent. You'd return to picking, dismissing it. But it would happen again. A voice just at the edge of hearing, words you couldn't quite make out. Sometimes it sounded like someone crying very softly, sometimes like laughter. You knew intellectually that no one was speaking, that these sounds weren't real, but they were so convincing, so present. Your brain, starved for auditory input, for the sound of human voices, was generating them itself. The hallucinations became more elaborate over time. Some pickers reported hearing entire conversations, multiple voices discussing things, arguing, chatting. But when they looked up, everyone was silent, working. It was disturbing, disorienting, made you question your own perception. Were you going mad? Was this real? How could you trust your senses when they told you things that clearly weren't happening?
The silence that was meant to maintain order, to prevent communication, it drove people into their own heads, into places where reality began to blur, where the boundary between real and imagined grew thin. Beyond voices, there were other sounds. The sound of rope being picked, that distinctive rasp of fiber against fiber, the soft crackle of tar breaking, the whisper of hemp strands separating. You heard these sounds constantly during work. They became the background noise of your existence. But then, you'd hear them when there was no rope. Lying on your plank bed at night, trying to sleep, you'd hear it, the sound of picking, clear as day, as though someone were working right beside you. You'd open your eyes, look around. Darkness, silence, no one picking. But the sound continued in your head, a phantom echo of the day's work playing on repeat. Or you'd be eating your meal, hands momentarily free of rope, and you'd hear it, the rasp and crackle, so real you'd look down at your empty hands, expecting to see rope there. This wasn't exactly hallucination. It was more like your brain had become so attuned to these sounds, so saturated with them, that it continued generating them even in their absence. Like how you might continue to feel the rocking of a boat hours after reaching shore. Except this never stopped. The phantom sounds of oakum picking followed you everywhere, invaded your sleep, interrupted your few moments of rest. Your mind couldn't escape the work, even when your hands could. The rope was always there, even when it wasn't. Always needing to be picked, always rasping, always present. Every morning you woke knowing what faced you, the quota, the pounds that had to be picked, the weighing that would come at day's end. For some people, this anticipatory anxiety became overwhelming. Panic attacks would strike without warning. Your heart would race, your breathing would become rapid, shallow. A sense of impending doom would wash over you, irrational but utterly convincing. You couldn't pick during a panic attack. Your hands shook too badly. Your breath came too fast. Your mind was consumed by pure animal fear. But the quota didn't care about panic attacks. The overseers didn't recognize them as legitimate. They saw only someone who'd stopped working, who was wasting time. So you'd be punished for the panic, struck, threatened, told to get back to work, which only made the panic worse, created a feedback loop. Fear of punishment feeding the anxiety that caused you to stop working, which brought the punishment, which increased the fear. Some people developed chronic anxiety, a constant low-level dread that never quite went away. You woke with it, worked with it, slept poorly because of it. Your stomach stayed knotted, your shoulders permanently tense, your jaw clenched. The psychological weight of the quota, that precise, unforgiving number, pressed down on you every moment. Would you make it today? What if you fell short? What if your hands were too damaged, too tired? What if the rope was particularly difficult? The what-ifs spiraled endlessly, anxiety feeding on itself, growing larger, more consuming, until all you were was fear and hands and rope. Nothing else remained. Sometimes the mind simply left. Not unconsciousness, not sleep, but a dissociative state where you were physically present but mentally gone. It would happen mid-work. Your hands would stop moving. You'd sit there staring at nothing, the rope loose in your grip. Minutes would pass, sometimes longer. You weren't thinking during these episodes, weren't feeling, weren't really anywhere. Just blank, empty, absent. The mind, overwhelmed by monotony and stress, had simply disconnected, shut down the conscious experience to protect itself from the unbearable present. Other pickers might notice, might try to alert you with a gesture, a careful look, because speaking was forbidden. Or the overseer would notice, would strike you, shake you, demand you return to work. And you'd come back, blinking, disoriented, not sure where you'd gone or how long you'd been gone.
The rope was still in your hands, the pile still unfinished. Time had passed, but you had no memory of it. These dissociative episodes became more frequent for some people, the mind's escape route to reality, a way to simply not be present for the work. But there was a cost. Each time you dissociated, you lost time, fell further behind on your quota, increased the likelihood of punishment, and the episodes became harder to control, started happening not just during work, but at other times too, during meals, during the night. Your grip on continuous conscious experience began to slip. Reality became fragmented, a series of disconnected moments rather than a coherent flow. You were coming apart, piece by piece, the mind breaking under pressure it was never designed to withstand. Children, in their resilience and in their desperation, found ways to cope that adults didn't. They created imaginary friends, but not ordinary imaginary friends. These were tar friends, companions made of oakum, given personalities, given voices in the child's mind. A child might pick apart a piece of rope and form a small figure from the loose oakum, crude, barely recognizable as human-shaped, but to the child it was real. They'd give it a name, whisper to it when the overseers weren't looking, create elaborate stories about it. The tar friend would sit beside them during work, would encourage them, tell them they were doing well, promise that someday they'd leave this place together. In the enforced silence, in the isolation, even surrounded by other people, these imaginary companions provided comfort, a sense of not being alone. Some children had multiple tar friends, a whole family of them, brothers and sisters and parents made of picked fiber, more real to the child than the actual people around them. It was break-hearting and necessary, a survival mechanism for young minds trying to endure the unendurable. But it worried the overseers when they noticed a child whispering to a ball of oakum, moving it around as though it were alive, becoming agitated if it was taken away. They'd confiscate the tar friends, throw them away, punish the child for wasting oakum, for playing instead of working. But the child,
We've traveled a long path together through this history, through the rope and the tar, through the damaged hands and lungs, through the broken minds and endless hours. Now we approach the end, not just the end of our story, but the end of oakum picking itself. How the practice finally declined, why it stopped, what happened to those who'd spent their lives doing this work, and what legacy it left behind. This is a quieter section, reflective, a time to understand not just what oakum picking was, but what it meant, what it revealed about the society that created it, what scars it left, both individual and collective. Let us move gently toward closure, toward understanding, toward remembering. For years, the brutality of workhouses was hidden behind walls, behind silence, behind the simple fact that no one particularly cared what happened to paupers. But in 1845, something changed. The Andover workhouse scandal broke into public consciousness. Andover, in Hampshire, was like many workhouses. It had oakum rooms, it had strict discipline, it had quotas and punishments. But it also had a master, the man in charge, who was particularly cruel, who reduced food rations below even the meager standards, who administered beatings with enthusiasm. The inmates were starving, actually starving, and they were assigned to break bones, another form of workhouse labor, crushing animal bones for fertilizer. The inmates were so hungry that they were found gnawing on the rotting bones, desperate for any nutrition, any marrow that might remain. When this was discovered, when journalists began investigating, the full horror of Andover became public. The beatings,
the starvation, the inhumane conditions. And while bone crushing was the specific trigger, oakum picking came under scrutiny too. The damaged hands were documented, the quotas examined, the punishments recorded. For the first time, the general public, people who'd never been inside a workhouse, who'd never picked oakum, were confronted with what was being done in their name. There was outrage, genuine shock. Reforms were promised, investigations launched, the master of Andover was removed. But the system itself, the system continued. The reforms were modest, superficial. The oakum rooms remained open. Still, a crack had formed. Public attention, once drawn, didn't fully disappear. The workhouses could no longer operate in complete secrecy. Their brutality had been exposed. It was a beginning, small but real. In 1838, a young writer named Charles Dickens published a novel, Oliver Twist. In it, there's a scene, young Oliver in the workhouse, surrounded by other boys. They're picking oakum. Dickens doesn't dwell on it, just a mention, a detail of workhouse life, but it's there, preserved in literature, in a story that would be read by millions for generations. Oliver Twist brought the workhouse into Victorian drawing rooms, made comfortable people think about poverty, about institutions, about what happened to children who had nothing. The oakum picking was just one detail among many, but Dickens chose to include it, recognized it as emblematic of the workhouse experience, that monotonous, degrading, endless labor, destroying young hands, stealing childhood. And because Dickens was Dickens, because his writing had power, reached people, moved them, the oakum picking in Oliver Twist became part of cultural memory. People who'd never seen oakum knew about it from Dickens, understood, at least abstractly, that this was something cruel done to poor children. It wasn't enough to end the practice. Fiction alone couldn't dismantle the system, but it planted seeds, created awareness, made it harder for society to simply ignore what was happening. Art can do that, bear witness, preserve memory, ensure that even forgotten labor isn't completely forgotten. Dickens gave oakum picking permanence, made sure it would be remembered, even when the last piece of rope was finally picked. Following the scandals, journalists began investigating workhouses more systematically. They visited the silent cells, the isolation rooms where prisoners picked oakum alone. They interviewed inmates, documented conditions, and they wrote about what they found. Articles appeared in newspapers and magazines, descriptions of the oakum rooms, accounts of the quotas, the punishments, and the damaged hands. Some journalists focused on the physical toll, the infections, the amputations, the respiratory diseases. Others documented the psychological breakdowns, the inmates who'd gone mad from the monotony and silence, the dissociative episodes, the hallucinations. These weren't dry reports. These were vivid, detailed accounts designed to shock and move readers, and they worked. Public opinion began to shift. Not quickly, not uniformly. There was still plenty of support for the workhouse system, plenty of people who believed paupers deserved harsh treatment. But cracks widened, questions were asked. The unthinking acceptance of workhouse brutality began to erode. The journalists weren't activists necessarily. They were simply reporting what they saw. But in reporting it, in making it public, in forcing people to confront the reality, they contributed to change. Slow change, incremental, but change nonetheless. The silent cells became slightly less silent. The quotas were occasionally questioned. The worst abuses were sometimes curtailed. It wasn't enough, but it was something, a beginning. While social reform moved slowly, technology moved faster. The age of sail was ending. The age of iron and steam was beginning. In the 1860s, iron ships began to replace wooden ones. Not all at once. Wooden ships continued to be built and sailed for decades more, but the transition had begun. Iron ships didn't need oakum in the same way. They didn't have wooden seams to be caulked. Their hulls were riveted metal plates. Waterproofing was achieved through different means. The demand for oakum began to decline. Slowly at first, the wooden merchant fleet was still enormous. The Royal Navy still operated hundreds of wooden vessels that needed constant maintenance. But year by year, the demand decreased. Fewer ships needing oakum, fewer contracts for workhouses to fill. This had a strange effect on the oakum rooms. You'd think reduced demand would mean easier work, easier quotas. Instead, the opposite happened. As contracts dried up, workhouses competed more aggressively for the remaining business, and to remain competitive, they needed to produce oakum more cheaply, which meant extracting more labor from each picker, raising quotas, cutting costs on tools and facilities. The final decades of oakum picking, perversely, were among the hardest, the most desperate, the quotas the highest. The practice was dying, yes, but it was dying hard, and those still trapped in it suffered more, not less, as the end approached. But by then the damage was done. By the 1990s, oakum picking as a large-scale industrial practice was effectively over. Some workhouses continued small-scale operations into the early 2000s, but these were exceptions, holdovers from an earlier era. The demand had collapsed, the technology had moved on, the practice was no longer economically viable. The oakum rooms stood empty, the piles of rope no longer arrived, the scales gathered dust. For the administrators, this was simply an economic reality. They found other work for inmates, updated their practices, moved with the times. But for those who'd spent years, decades picking oakum, what now? They were released, many of them. The workhouses didn't need them for oakum anymore, and they were too damaged for other labor. Out into a world that had moved on, that had iron ships and mechanized factories, that didn't need destroyed hands. Unemployable, unmarketable, used up. What happens to people society has consumed and then discarded? The ex-pickers carried the oakum work with them in their bodies. The tar-stained, scarred hands, the frozen shoulders, the picker's cough, the missing fingers. They tried to find work, tried to support themselves, but employers took one look at their hands and knew where they'd been, what they'd done. More importantly, they could see the hands wouldn't work properly, couldn't grip tools properly, couldn't perform fine motor tasks, couldn't do most forms of manual labor. Sorry, we need someone more capable. The very institution that was supposed to have reformed them, prepared them for productive labor, had destroyed their ability to work. It was designed to deter people from seeking relief, but in destroying their hands, it ensured they'd need